And so this was very much a team effort. And I want to give a huge thanks. You're going to hear from many of the project team members today. And I also want to give a shout out to a few people who aren't going to present, but played really key roles, including Chris Malo and Jillian Bauer-Reese. All these team members brought a real wealth of experience and perspectives to this work. And I want to thank everyone from the Inquirer, the Lenfest Local Lab, and the Brown Institute who generously shared time and insights with us as we did this research. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my amazing colleague, Professor Lynn Washington, to give us some context.
Good afternoon. My name is Lynn Washington. I'm a professor in the journalism department. I worked for 10 years at the Philadelphia Daily News. And while there, I was co-founder of a group called the Third World Caucus, and we examined issues regarding coverage of particular communities and employment opportunities for non-whites. Last year, as we all know, there was a great upheaval around the issue of police brutality that led into issues involving racial inequities in our country. And those racial reckonings extended far beyond the criminal justice system, very much into the news media. And this audit is a product of that awareness, as well as an awareness that long-standing issues at the institution of the Philadelphia Inquirer needed to be addressed. While this particular headline has been cited as the reason for the audit, it was in many ways just the straw that broke the camel's back. And you will see from the audit findings that many of the issues that have been cited, say in the 1968 Kerner report, are items that were highlighted in this particular report. And I would just like to close by saying this effort to get equity in accurate coverage as well as employment opportunities really stretches back to the founding of this country, when the very first effort by African Americans to get fairer coverage out of the news media took place in Philadelphia in 1794. And I'll turn things over now to my colleague, Arlene Morgan.
Hello. Some of you know me from my time at the Inquirer. I spent 31 years there, ending as assistant managing editor before going off to Columbia in the year 2000. During the last decade, we worked pretty rigorously on diversity plan, a strategic plan that brought us, in fact, the first diversity award from Knight Ridder for the excellence we achieved in hiring, a content audit through the early 90s, and a host of other programs. So it can be done. And so here we are again. And the mission is to create an accurate picture of who the Inquirer covers and how they cover them and why they do what they do. So that is the mission that you should all understand. The objectives are to hold up a mirror to existing coverage through the content audit. And given the context to qualitative interviews with the staff, of which there were many, we were offering our findings and recommendations, and we hope to arm the staff with tools to follow up. The project timeline and the scope. We looked at 6 random weeks, 42 random days between August 2019 and July 2020. More than 30,000 stories, elements overall, 50 to 90 stories, and assets each day. In total, we looked at 14,416 people and conducted 46 in-depth interviews with the staff. The key findings: overwhelmingly, majority of the people who appear in the Inquirer are white and male. Most non-white subjects, mainly Blacks, appear in sports. More diverse reporting teams feature more people of color in their stories. Staff concerns went beyond how often people of color were covered, but how they were covered. Conversations revealed opportunities to implement more inclusive workplace practices around sourcing, editing, community engagement, and workplace equity. Who's next? My content audit numbers.
So I think Arlene Aaron is going to jump in here and share these. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Aaron Pallofer. I'm a professor of journalism at Temple. I got involved in this project over the break when the data had been collected and when the analysis was beginning. So really the analysis and the data and the graphics are the work of myself and Professor Jillian Bauer-Rees. So the audit looked at about 3,000 stories from a number of random days. You can flip to the next chart. And I guess not surprisingly, the results are that the Inquirer's coverage is disproportionately focusing on white non-Hispanic people. These are the breakdowns of all the people referenced in stories, images, and other assets that are in here. I just want to be clear about one thing. Occasionally, one of us might slip and use the word source or interview or something like that. I want to be really clear that those 14,416 people are people in images, people who are interviewed, people who are quoted, and people who are referenced. The data didn't discriminate among those things, and that is one area we might consider that's one thing we might consider doing in the future. Again, overwhelmingly, the people referenced in stories were overwhelmingly male. Flip to the next. The newsroom makeup, these are numbers that came from the Inquirer itself, 225 employees, broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, and intersections of each. Flip. Again, the newsroom itself is overwhelmingly male, or white, I'm sorry, and majority male. And when looked at by the intersection of gender and race, the majority or the plurality in newsrooms white now. Again, the numbers are a little bit more even among genders when you look at editors, but again, it's the vast majority of the newsroom is white. And desk composition, we looked at these numbers by desk. So you can see here that, once again, most desks in the Inquirer tend to be majority, plurality, if not majority, white. Some more than others. Same story here. Yep, same story there. The visuals desk is one area of the newsroom that does stand out for having a bit more diversity. Sports is not. So some of the takeaways from all the data work, there is a when you compare the ethnicity of the reporter and of the people referenced, white reporters tend to report or include white people in stories. 67% of stories written by white writers or all white reporting teams had majority white subjects. And I'm sorry, go back one more. And a plurality of those stories, 38%, were stories that quoted all or nearly all white subjects. That's 90% or more. So 38% of all the stories written by white reporters had 90% white sorry, I almost did it. White subjects, 90% white subjects or more. One thing that we did notice when we looked at the, albeit far fewer stories that were written by non-white reporters or by reporting teams that included at least one non-white journalist, is that they were far more likely to include non-white subjects. A majority of those stories, 58%, had at least 50% non-white subjects. It's a little bit, the numbers I don't think necessarily flow from the tongue, but the takeaway here is that diversity seems to beget diversity. There you go. Diversity begets diversity. And stories written by all white reporting teams, or the majority of the subjects tend to be far more white than stories written by journalists or teams of journalists where there's at least some diversity.
Thank you, Aaron. So we wanted to take these numbers and try to contextualize them. And so in order to do that, we paired this with a qualitative examination where we interviewed 46 staff members, half editors or managers, half reporters, columnists, or photographers. And of those, 26 were white journalists and 20 were journalists of color. We're not going to get, this is like a 100-page report. So with all of this, there's a lot more detail in the report, but just to kind of give some overviews of what we found. First, when it came to sourcing practices, there were several challenges when it came to developing more diverse sources that people shared with us. Some said they weren't given time to develop sources, or they focused on particular kinds of expertise where white men were overrepresented. Another big issue was that most people did not talk about race, the race of people, when they were pitching or editing stories. And so the problem is, particularly when editors and reporters are white, even if people have good intentions, if they don't openly talk about race, there was a risk that white would be the default. When it came to editing practices, journalists of color shared frustrations they had about having to change their stories and how they frame them, their style choices, because an editor was concerned about how the story would be received by readers who were assumed to be white. There was an expectation that stories about communities of color had to be explained for white readers. Community engagement is something that many suggest can help repair relationships with communities of color, but there was not a shared understanding of what was meant by community engagement at the Inquirer or who should be doing it. So there were newsroom projects, but some reporters said that they were interested in doing this work as well, but they didn't have enough information, or they didn't necessarily feel completely supported in doing that work. Of course, so much of this comes down to who gets to tell stories and how they're supported within the workplace. So regarding efforts to have more journalists of color in the newsroom, there had been progress with recent hires, but where people sat in the newsroom was an issue, as you just saw. As we saw, some of the most resourced and promoted desks, like the investigative team, were mostly or all white. And there were also concerns around pay equity and who got access to opportunities and mentorship. And people shared experiences of racism in the workplace. And finally, when people spoke about how they saw the Inquirer's efforts to address diversity and inclusion, we heard a real range of views. So there was an appreciation by most that this was a needed undertaking. And there was an appreciation that this work and this time was involving not just journalists of color, but also it had many white journalists involved in the process. But there were a number of concerns, but that barrier still remained to real transformation. One of them was that this was not a culture of talking about race unless there was a problem. So some white journalists we spoke with were surprised that there was a problem in the first place. there had been a sense that just being progressive and having good intentions should have somehow been enough. There was not a culture of actively working on anti-racism. Discussions were more often reactive and about how to avoid embarrassment. The other issue was a sense of distrust within and between demographic groups and teams. So this presents a serious challenge for establishing practices to name and explore sensitive issues around race. And I'm going to now hand it over to Sarah from the Lenfest Local Lab to share some about the mapping component of this project.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And thanks everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Schmalbach, the director of the Lenfest Local Lab at the Inquirer. And the lab is a product and innovation team. We're funded by the Lenfest Institute. And the reason we got involved is that in this audit is that the last few years we've been kind of experimenting with news products that use location when it comes to their delivery or design, particularly on a neighborhood level. So some of the technology that we were building for our projects felt like it could be applied to the audit. And so we took the stories that were audited by the team and we were able to put them on a map. So I'm going to show you a couple of different views of what that looked like so that you can think about some of the information that you've heard from everyone else through the lens of geography. We built, just a quick caveat, we built this technology with our partners at the Brown Institute. They're a bi-coastal research institute housed at Columbia Journalism School, and they also work with the Stanford Engineering School. The tool also uses NLP, natural language processing, deep learning, and geolocation techniques to kind of pull these locations out of stories and plot them on a map. And at the end of the day, our goal is to combine the speed and scope of modern day algorithms. So take this new technology that's evolving, apply it to the intelligence that exists within organizations, and hopefully change the way communities are covered, which is kind of everyone's goal here on this call. So the next slide, great, is kind of the first observation we were able to make is how coverage lays out across the 8 counties in the area. The map shows here, based on kind of how dark each county is, that the highest concentration of locations mentioned in stories were in Philadelphia and Montgomery counties. Meanwhile, the lowest concentration of locations mentioned was in Burlington County, New Jersey. And so that's a high level insight, but one way you could use the tool to look deeper is to look at the topics that are covered in each county. You could also adjust the date range and look for seasonality if that changes the nature of coverage, or even look at what coverage looks like before or after the pandemic. And seeing the data on a map is meant to just provide a jumping off point for conversation. It's not meant to provide answers, just kind of a different way of viewing all of this information. I'll show you a second slide. This shows you the number of locations mentioned in stories by neighborhood in Philadelphia. So it's really hard to see on this map, I apologize, but I'll just let you know that the highest concentration of locations mentioned were in Rittenhouse Square, University City, and the Stadium District. And after that, we saw a significant drop off in any kind of levels of concentration of locations and stories. So a suggestion we have for deeper analysis would be to look at how many of these locations mentioned are tied to institutions in those neighborhoods, things like the Art Museum, City Hall, or the Wells Fargo Center, and kind of keep conversations going on about what we're covering and where and why. The next slide, this is the last one I'll show you. We wanted to highlight how the tool starts to let you look at intersectional issues related to equity and representation based on just the data that we have from the audit. And there's a lot more intersectional analysis that we'd like to be able to explore in the future. It also presents a lot of risks too in the analysis, so you have to kind of be very sure of the data that you're gathering. But for now, we simply wanted to show you that the tool, as it stands, can let you look at the intersection of geography, race, gender, and topic of stories. So this map is going to show you that the highest concentration of locations mentioned in stories that do feature Black men were in 2 neighborhoods, University City and the Stadium District. And when you dive a little bit deeper, you see that the most frequent topics are college sports and professional sports. So those were the 3 views. Just a really quick note on next steps. So we're going to continue to develop the tool with the Inquirer and other newsroom partners. We're going to be improving the accuracy of the locations that come out. and incorporating data overlays. So looking at census tract information and American Community Surveys information on top of the stories and see what that can tell us. And also we'd like to do support deeper analysis around topics, race and gender, institutions and institutional voices, what a primary versus a secondary location is in a story, and ways to incorporate community feedback. Because we can use this tool to put things on a map, but without discussing it with people who have these trends in context, that's how we're going to be able to do pull meaningful insights from it. So with that, thank you for your time. I'll hand it back over to Andrea. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So we'll just share a little bit about the recommendations that we offered in the report, and some of the next steps that we're hoping for. So overall, we found that one of the challenges the Inquirer has is that there are a lot of people with really good intentions, but who are also immersed in a culture of traditions about how things had always been done. So we think that establishing newsroom processes and policies can be a way to help people keep focused and on track to shift some of these traditions that have assumptions baked into them that end up prioritizing the interests of white audiences and staff, even if unintentionally. And so to help that effort, we recommended focusing on a more inclusive sourcing. We suggested adopting regular ongoing source tracking, potentially, in conjunction with the tool that Sarah just shared. We also encouraged the Inquirer to convene a conversation across newsrooms about what makes a good source. Can you consider different kinds of expertise? Could you adopt community organizing strategies to build relationships with community members that could lead to expanding the kinds of voices that you have in stories? And finally, they may want to try things like a universal source list where people across the newsroom and potentially community partners could contribute to a shared list. But they would have to make sure they set it up in a way that incentivizes participation and doesn't just put another unpaid burden on journalists of color to populate it. Regarding editing practices, we suggested that editors, especially white editors, take responsibility for really building their own cultural competency and be careful about leaning too much on their colleagues of color. We noted that there have been good efforts to explore some pre-publication tools to check potentially sensitive topics. They have something called a gut check Slack channel that they've been working on. And we also suggested that post-publication feedback was something that's important to look at. They have something called story autopsies that they've been looking into. And ideally, we tried to involve community members in this process. But we think it's important also to talk not just about stories where there's something that's seen as problematic, but also discuss examples of stories where they've done a good job including diverse stories and perspectives. And then in terms of community engagement, we think that this is an area that has a lot of potential to help the Inquirer repair relationships with communities that have historically been marginalized, especially communities of color. And we recommend exploring a number of options like possibly a standing community advisory group that either represents communities or topic areas, accountability conversations where members of the public have opportunities to talk about stories and build relationships with journalists. And they might also want to do more research on the information needs of community members. And that all of these things are things that affect the newsroom, but also could have an impact on the company as a whole as they think about marketing and distribution. And then we underline the importance of workplace equity efforts. So looking not just at hiring journalists of color, but making sure that they're well represented on key desks and leadership roles. People expressed a particular need for Black perspectives in leadership and Black and Brown perspectives in news coverage. And just making sure that once people are in the door, they're paid equitably and given opportunities and mentorship. We recommended offering resources for affinity groups for journalists of color and for white journalists to work on their own cultural competency without creating additional labor for colleagues of color. And also ensuring that accountability is incentivized. Goals around diversity, equity, inclusion, and community engagement can be potentially built into things like performance review processes. And then ensuring that goals for connecting with diverse communities are newsroom-wide priorities and don't just get sidelined or siloed. So it shouldn't be just one person's job. And then finally, we wanted to acknowledge that all of this is happening within a bigger structural context, that particularly there's funding challenges for local journalism. There's the larger context of structural racism in the U.S. And as numerous newsrooms around the US and beyond are grappling with these issues, we suggest that they think about potentially trying to exchange best practices, tools, lessons learned, and also potentially to collaborate and advocate on approaches to funding that recognize journalism as a public good, among other things. So those are sort of the key takeaways and recommendations that we offered from this. We also kind of had
Uh-oh, you're frozen.
I'm actually going to
Andrea, this is David. If you can hear me, your image is freezing a little bit, so you may have to go back over a couple of things you just mentioned. We missed a little bit of what you just said.
Sorry about that. I think that if you've got most of the recommendations, then I think we're probably fine. I was basically just saying that we're going to be checking back with the Inquirer in the next 6 months and just sort of seeing how this process goes. And this might be actually, especially if my internet is bad, a great opportunity to introduce the Inquirer side of the audit team, the original audit team. It's now a slightly bigger group, to share how this was received at the Inquirer and what has already wheels have already been put into motion on these things. So I think Amy and Jessica were going to actually, can all of you, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And maybe if all of you who are in the Inquirer original audit group, if you could just say your name and what your role is at the Inquirer really briefly, just because I want people to have a sense of the kinds of expertise that was involved in this.
Hi, Amy Rosenberg. I've been a reporter for 35 years. Also, am a vice president of the Inquirer News Guild. So we've had previously been working on pay equity issues prior to that.
Who else here is Tim?
Go ahead. I'm Erin. I was on my business reporter. I was also on the committee with Amy, Tim Ty, and Valerie Russ.
Tim and Valerie, are you here? Yeah, you are.
Hi, I'm Tim Ty. I'm a photographer at the Inquirer.
Is Valerie here? Valerie? I see she's here. She might be having audio or video challenges, but Valerie's amazing and contributed a lot. Sorry. If you can join in later, please do.
Jessica first, and then I'll follow up. Or
Yeah, sure. I'm Jessica Parks. I'm an assistant managing editor, and I'm co-leading the Inquirer for All working groups, who are doing a lot of the newsroom work on the recommendations, even prior to the audit coming out. So we can talk a little bit to next steps, but I really wanted Amy to speak first, just about how the audit was received in the newsroom, because obviously, if you've read through it, the 120 pages was a lot to land all at once in the newsroom on a working day. So,
okay, so this is just from my own personal perspective, and then obviously my colleagues can add whatever they want. But from my perspective, the audit landed pretty hard at the Inquirer. Some people disputed some of the conclusions, particularly whether we should be comparing coverage numbers to the city itself or to the region more generally. There was also some disappointment that issues involving coverage of LGBTQ were not included in the overall audit process. But the overall message, and in particular, the very detailed summaries of the interviews, really struck a chord and put us in what I would say is fix mode, as opposed to just arguing over the premise mode. Personally, I felt a lot of satisfaction, as I've said to Andrea. I thought it captured a lot of truth about how things work at the Inquirer. I think the audit is now kind of threaded throughout a lot of the discussions and work that had already been going on. Hopefully threaded through people's reporting and writing processes as well. I know that's happened with us on this on the committee, where we had kind of an informal dialogue that started when we all got together, and that's really continued, and that's been helpful. There have been meetings within departments and listening sessions newsroom wide. These have been very raw in my experience, though I'm not sure some editors are admitting which parts of the audit may have been about them or about things that they do. It's a tough read. People's morale is already low. I worry that the response has been a little too HR and publisher side driven. That might be the union rep in me, and that editors are still managing their response up. You know what I mean? I like that the assumptions of the audit that we need to do better, we need to be proactively inclusive and anti-racist and work harder to reflect and grow our audience are now built into what we are doing. I admit to being skeptical that the new gut check Slack channel would be useful, but I think it has been extremely well used so far, with lots of great discussion about a wide range of issues. So I think that's been a great success. It's extremely labor intensive though. So I wonder about, long-term liability of that. We're all pretty exhausted. And so that might need like a rotating cast of moderators. That's all.
Thanks, Amy. This is David. Go ahead, Jess. I know you had some comments you wanted to make. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't want to take up too much time because I'd like to get to questions and to really kind of figuring out what it is that you guys want to know about the audit. So I'll just say that if there are people from other newsrooms who are thinking about venturing on an audit of your own and you would like to pick our brains about how it went, I am completely available to talk about how our experience went. We're a pretty open book at the Inquirer. It's one of the great things about being a nonprofit owned newsroom. And so if we can help in any way, I'm happy to do that. And I hope that we will have a lot more public facing bits of progress that will be shared with readers very soon.
Thanks, Jessica. I think also just very quickly to give another context, and Amy actually alluded to this. So in addition to the audit that was happening, we have a parallel and connected track in terms of the working groups led by myself and 4 other of our Temple professors, Professor Lauren Bullock, Professor Ron Anderson-Bell, Professor Lori Tharps, and Professor Sherry Hope Culver, working on 4 other areas: our newsroom culture, our editorial voice, our policy and process, and newsroom culture, if I didn't say that already. I always forget. So these processes are going on a parallel track. And as both Amy and Jessica have mentioned, is that as the audit is now very much part of the work that we are all doing, it is very much, as I mentioned at the top of our comments, a living and breathing document that's going to continue to guide the work that we're doing. So looking at our time, we have just about everybody who's worked on this. We know that this is kind of like drinking from the fire hose because there's a lot of information. We also know a lot of folks have read every page of the audit, which is, again, part of what our hope and intent was. But we want to provide an opportunity in addition to the things that are going through the chat, because that's always very active in terms of looking at questions that might arise, provide folks an opportunity to raise any questions or even comments based on where we are going forward. And I know we've got a big group, some 86 participants on this particular Zoom call. So I'll do my best to try to look and see if hands, either virtually or human hands, get raised when we're looking forward. So Tahid, I see you have a question about the reaction from researchers when the Inquirer leadership did their own reporting. did not public or transparently implementing transparently into the recommendations. Any advice that we can give as to the basic transparent commitment from the Inquirer leadership, who is telling its staff that it wants to be an anti-racist institution. If I may, before anybody else wants to answer that, one of the things that we have emphasized throughout our process, both in terms of the working group and the audit, is that transparency is very important and a very important component of building trust. We also recognize that that trust is something that's built over time and not overnight. But let me yield to the rest of the folks who were part of this process, if anybody wants to address Tahid's question that was posed in the chat.
I'll just say quickly that the top editors declined to be interviewed by the reporters who were doing the story on the audit, which did not go over well at all with us. And they Gabe subsequently apologized for that and said it was a mistake, but that was not really a great vote of confidence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that point? And I know Tahid also had an additional comment in the chat. And I to Amy's point about the reaction from leadership about apologizing for not having that responded to those questions and answers in a more comprehensive way. This is also part of the relationship, right? In terms of building that trust and holding people accountable for the work that we're doing going forward.
I would just second Amy's. I was a little disappointed not to have a comment in that article, but I'm still hopeful that there will be a commitment to transparency based on conversations we've had subsequently, that we're going to be checking back and being and sharing everything that we learn transparently. So hopefully that will just be some small part of furthering accountability. But I agree that that's a super important thing to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that question, Tahid.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
Tahid, I can just say, I think, we are all very frustrated that no, public comment or commitment was made, but at least within the newsroom, as far as I know, all these recommendations are being worked on by, staff members in these different working groups. Some of them have been, bound up the chain. For example, like the pay equity issue is something that the newsroom folks can't handle. I don't know of anything that's off the table, but I agree that the lack of transparency is frustrating, and that we were all very surprised to see a lack of comment in that original report.
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly, first and foremost, the work that all of y'all have been doing has been super amazing and instrumental. And really the work that y'all have been doing, basically volunteer, has been amazing. And I want to commend all of you for really going through all of this process and really having to address this internally. It's just, with that specific story and the conversations that I've seen, particularly in journalism groups and in Black community groups too, is that the fact that there was an opportunity, I guess would say, the disappointment comes from the fact that there was an opportunity to really be open and public and transparent from leadership, and being able to message that to the public so that, in terms of optics, there was at least a registration here that's saying, hey, we're going to try and do something. But I appreciate the commentary, and I really support all the work that y'all are doing. So keep it moving, keep it pushing.
Thank you, Tahid. And I think this brings up something that I don't know if we mentioned kind of at the top, but the decision for this audit to be completely independent was made very early on. And so it's worth noting that aside from our group, aside from the five of us who were working as consultants with the Temple auditors, no one inside the company saw a word of that report. They didn't know what was in it. They didn't, and I think that's where a lot of the delays and the missteps came in and when it was released. Speaking for myself and not for management, but I think if anybody else is doing audits, that might be something that you want to pay more attention to in advance is what's going to happen when it comes out. And if you haven't seen it, if you weren't involved in the report and you don't know what to expect, you still have to have an answer for it.
Good point, Jess. And hopefully folks saw the chat that Professor Bullock put in about the Newsroom Culture Committee, which he heads up, looking at building relationships and using this process to build relationships that increase the trust, because this is obviously not a static type of exercise. It's something that is dynamic and moves forward. Professor Bullock, do you want to say anything more about that at this point?
Sure, I can jump in and just share that prior to even the audit being released, the people that were working on that committee already had a sense that there were some trust issues. So when it came out, they were already doing some things to make sure that people felt included. One of the things that was brought up was just that people didn't feel like they knew each other. And so they started talking about, planning like coffee chats and just informal check-ins so that people could build those relationships that they missed because they weren't in the physical building itself. And so when it came out, some of that stuff was already in the works, and hopefully in the next, few weeks, those things will start getting off the ground so that people can participate.
Absolutely. And if I can echo that, I know that that's part of the listening sessions that we had, the physical displacement of everyone being geographically separate is something that we want to look to in terms of when the Inquirer does in fact come back together, how that can help to reset the culture somewhat. I want to respond though to Steve Butler's comment. I think it's very good because that also came up in terms of what are we? Are we looking at the analytics side of the business or our instincts as journalists, and has the business side of the Inquirer weighed in on that issue? I think it's a very pertinent question. Does anyone want to, because certainly the quantitative side that was used in terms of looking at the research of the audit, as well as what does the balance between analytics and instinct in terms of determining, what stories get told, what story gets traction, and so forth. So does anyone want to tackle that? Hopefully I've addressed the question, Steve, that you've asked. Go ahead, Aaron. I see you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I would say not yet, because we still have not really answered the question of who our audience is. And that determines the business side, the acquirer. I will say we did get a $10 million PPP loan, a forgivable loan. So we're hoping that gives us a little breathing room on the business side so that we can weigh these issues. Because, the fact of the matter is that our subscriptions are down. A lot of our subscribers are out of work. And so we're trying to suss out exactly who are we writing for. We're still trying to suss out who are we writing for. So I would say not yet.
Thank you for that, Aaron. I see also that Professor Greg Feisman has put in a very good question as it relates to the sharing of these insights and best practices across media outlets. One of the things that was certainly came up both with the audit as well as the working groups, as well as the listening sessions, is that we've got people who have had journeys at other media outlets. So being able to, and if this is to your point, Greg, is kind of looking at how that is going to be done. I think that it is, and I won't speak for the committee, but so I'll let them answer that in terms of how these are part of the larger industry issues around trust, as well as the racial reckoning. And even given the unfortunate attack that's happening on our Asian American communities, is also part of how do we then make sure that we share what our best practice in terms of our coverage as well as representation. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to talk about that, sharing across media outlets.
I'll just flag what I just put into the chat, that I think this is a super important thing that needs to happen a lot more. And just in the short amount of time since we first released this, I've heard from a number of newsrooms who are interested in tackling these same issues. And also just there have been other folks who have been doing this work too. And so There's a discussion, another Zoom, same time next week. We'll hear from a couple of other newsrooms who've done different elements that are not quite the same as this process, but from Wisconsin Public Radio and from the Seattle Times. But I think that this is just something that has to happen more and more. So.
Thank you
And
for that,
I
Andrea.
will say pretty broadly that we do consult with other media outlets for pretty much every initiative that we're working on. The working groups have been in contact with the Seattle Times, who have had a gut check Slack channel for a few years, and they were extremely helpful in helping us with setting up the logistics for that and how it would work, things, pitfalls to avoid. And we are doing a lot of the same thing, reciprocally any way that we can. So it's definitely a different era of journalism now. There's a lot more cooperation and a lot of organizations sharing like very detailed, specific, sensitive information that previously would have been considered competitive or held closely.
Thank you, Amy, who shared something in the chat as it relates to what Seattle has done. And I would also say one comment that has been kind of consistent throughout both the working groups and kind of like the aftermath of the audit has been that if we do what we need to do, it will ultimately make our journalism better. And I think that kind of focusing on the work and also, as was mentioned before, the fact that, being geographically dispersed or even just interacting in these this type of Zoom format, there's not a lot of time for kind of like the socialization of covering news. So that is also something that we need to look at in terms of what will change once we, once we start to physically regather. And again, by having us as an opportunity to be intentional about resetting the culture. So I'm watching our time. We only have 8 minutes left. We knew we would run out of time, but want to see if anyone else has any other questions or comments that they would like to make around some of the things that were shared this morning or this afternoon. I think that if I may, probably the biggest challenge or around this is the work that happens going forward. And I know both Jess and Amy had alluded to what we are looking to do going forward, and in terms of the degree of accountability and transparency to do that, and also what degree of regularity might exist to continue to report back. I mean, I think that's a very important part of this process, so that we can have some degree of accountability and also kind of listening while we're trying to move some things forward. So I see, Tahid, you have your hand up for a question, and then Amy, if I can go to Tahid first and then back to you, is that all right? Okay, go ahead, Tahid.
This is just for the Inquirer journalists, but what can we, as the public, folks that are on the outside, so to speak, how can we be helping you? How can we be supporting your efforts? How can we be working in collaboration to help address some of these issues that you're consistently seeing and the things that you all are grappling with and whatnot? What can the public do to support y'all?
Great question. Amy, you have your hand up. That might be a good one for you to answer from the inside, if you wouldn't mind.
My first reaction to that is like story ideas, feedback. We had in our features audit discussion group, there was a discussion about our people in the community tailoring their story pitches, and because they think that our biases cause us to react to certain kinds of stories, the first stories, or the more some tropes that some people are tired of, but people feel like the only stories we're going to write about are certain kinds of stories. So that's a box that certainly I don't want to be in, and I don't want us to be in. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that all the talking back and forth is good, and we, like someone said, we've done a lot of talking about what made this story problematic, but then what are the better kinds of stories to do? We talked a lot about in this recent meeting about the big story we did on the West Philadelphia shootings and the gangs and Instagram, and for a lot of people it felt like, oh, we're just reworking these stories, and we put 3 reporters on it, and there was discussion about resources. What resources do we put on what beats? You know, kind of like should we be defunding the police reporters, you know, and moving them somewhere else? So those were all kinds of discussions that we're certainly open to a lot of public input on.
And Amy, thanks for responding to that. But I want to also honor if you had something else unrelated to your hand. And I saw Professor Karen Turner put a quote thing in the chat that I want to also raise. So go ahead, Amy.
No, I was just going to ask you, because you've sat in on all these audit meetings that were set up. There's a lot of different tracks, so I forget which ones, but did you have any overall, like you sat on the ones where we all signed up kind of randomly. Did you have any sense of like how it was received and how editors received it and that kind of stuff?
Sure. Thank you for that. I think that most folks were not shocked and not surprised. It affirmed some things that folks thought already, but I think it's also kind of connects to the quote that, or the comment that Tauhid made in terms of individual responsibility. One thing that I was really struck me was the fact that there's a lot, while there has to be an institutional response to a lot of this, many folks are saying, so what can I do personally in my role to be able to change the culture, to be able to have some ownership of that? So it's not what are they, meaning possibly management, doing to make this thing happen, but what am I as either as a staff writer or editor or wherever it is, because there is a shared responsibility in that. And that actually gives me a quick transition to Professor Turner's point about what are things in place to make sure that this change culture, how we measure it, how we assess that, will be able to endure as even leadership changes. And that's going to be critical. And her comment is well taken in terms of been there before. And that was also a comment that was made even during the listening sessions. So I think that there will be, I feel that there is a hopefulness, but also a healthy dose of skepticism to show that hopefulness and that we can believe in that. Professor Turner, did you want to comment more on that? I know we're almost running out of time, but I want to make sure I've captured your comment correctly.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Let me then yield, because I know we only have 3 minutes. Andrea, you may want to have some closing comments and then be able to close out, because again, we're going to run out of time before you know it.
Just to say thank you to everyone for joining the conversation, and thanks to you, David, and to all of the members of this group who've been working on this. And that we'll sort of keep watching it and see how it goes and be sharing back what we learn along the way. There'll also be several of us will also be on the thing next Monday if anyone wants to join the Engaged Journalism Exchange conversation. So we're always welcome input and feedback, and I hope that this pushes things along at least a little bit and we honor Brian's legacy by doing so. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I see the thanks also from Jessica and Amy and the rest of the Inquirer team. We could not, of course, do this without you all, but we also anticipate and look forward to continuing to work in partnership with you as we continue the journey going forward. I think that's going to be very critical in terms of making sure what we've started we'll be able to continue to, because this is not a destination-driven kind of thing. It's all about the journey to get to where we're striving to get to. So look forward to do that. So we're right at 1 o'clock. We want to thank you all for joining us. There will be more going forward. But thank you again for engaging in this conversation. It's a very important conversation. Be well.
Thank you.